Morning, everybody. My name is Kenny, and I'm an alcoholic. I'd like to tell you my sobriety date is June the 8th of 1989. I've been continuously sober since that date. My home group is the Empire Way group in Seattle, Washington. We meet on Wednesdays at 8 o'clock. Yeah, great meeting. I want to thank you. I want to thank Bob and especially the entire committee of Step Ashore for asking that I come and share here. And I wanted to say that it's a very meaningful time for me to be here because I was privy to some very early discussions on the formation of this conference and the vision that was to become. And when I walked in here last night and saw the packed room and the happy faces and all of the people and the parking lot overflowing, and I'd know that it was a sold-out conference, to be a part of the first annual Northwest Woodstock of AA conference is an incredible honor and a privilege, and I'm really grateful to be here. So thank you very much for that. Last night was my 16-year anniversary of being married to the beautiful and wonderful Shan. So when I let Shan know that for our 16-year, we've been together 18 years, been married for 16, for our 16-year anniversary, that we were going to an AA conference down, and she was ecstatic, I must say. That I always bring my big book up to the podium with me as a reminder of what it is that I'm supposed to be talking about when I talk in an AA meeting. And one of the things that I really love about the Woodstock of AA format, the reason I do that is because in telling my story and having fun, I can just get carried away and really forget to make it clear that the reason that I'm standing here is that I have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body as a result of a spiritual experience that occurred from the process of going through the steps as outlined in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I always like to make that clear up front and have the book in front of me. But the nice thing about the Woodstock of AA is it kind of takes all that shenanigans out of it, because I've been asked to come up here and speak on a specific topic on step 2 and 3. And I just love that format, the format of going through the steps through these talks by people. And you've got a great lineup of speakers to speak on the steps here. I'll tell you that in really thinking about the step 2 and 3, that there's, step 2, I'll get this out of the way and just say it now that, I'm a believer, so I can lift the veil just a little bit. I'm a strong Big Book sponsor. When I sponsor people, this is the only book we're reading during the first several months that we're working together. I read this book to the guys that I sponsor, and it's more than just reading, it's sharing my experience with the steps. And step 2, when I'm going through that process, is this chapter, We Agnostics. And step 3, of course, is found in our 4th chapter, or in our 5th chapter in How It Works. So chapters 4 and 5. I'm a believer, having read this book over the period of many years to many, many people, and I've seen a lot of people make their beds and walk again as a result of that. I've become a strong believer that this book is a spiritual masterpiece, and I say that with assurance. I've read a lot of spiritual material. And if you wanted to see the masterpiece, to put this in context, of Michelangelo's work, who did the Sistine Chapel and many, many, many other pieces and was a prolific artist, if you wanted to see his masterpiece, they tell you to go see the Statue of David. That somehow that is the most amazing of all of these wonderful things, that was his masterpiece. And if you wanted to see Rembrandt's masterpiece, then you would go to the Hermitage. If you wanted to read AA's masterpiece, Bill Wilson's masterpiece. You read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, particularly the chapter We Agnostics in Step 2. The book in that says that its main object is to enable us to find a power greater than ourselves which will solve our problem, singular. Now, they use the word problems in the plural sense on that same page later on, so I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that, but it's a powerful statement, the main object of the book. Clancy last night talked about the history of AA and in particular some of the earliest traceable roots to Alcoholics Anonymous coming from Dr. Carl Jung. And Carl Jung was a guy who had, to build on that just a little bit, if I might, was a guy that had this thought that there were archetypes among different categories of people, male and female, and from different cultures and different things. But with alcoholism and alcoholics in particular, he began to feel like this archetype was that there was a direct connection between the thirst for alcohol and the thirst for wholeness through a conscious contact with a power greater than yourself. That there was a connection between these things, that thirst somehow had some similarities, and he called it spiritus contra spiritum. And that's what that meant. And I find that's true. And one of the things Bill says in the big book is that we often watch a man's hopes rise when we describe this solution that we found, but we watch his face fall when we mention the subject of God, because it's a subject that the fellow thought he'd neatly evaded or was going to be able to entirely ignore somehow. And I can tell you that in my own experience working with people, that I found that in most cases, this piece also from We Agnostics, that deep down within every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. And I found that to be true. My wife Shannon, when she does fist steps with her girls, she has a piece where when she's looking in resentment of the father, for instance, she'll say, well, what are some of the great attributes of a father? Well, strong and a leader and loving and kind, yet, firm guidance and all of these kinds of things. And what's the great attributes that you would think of a mother? And, we look for God in these other people, and when they fail us, we turn to resentment, that we're seekers somehow in that way. But when you ask those questions, and I do the same thing with the guys that I sponsor. When I ask those questions and I'm looking at in the fifth step, I find that the answers are so universal. These fundamental ideas of kindness and love and compassion and a great example and a good friend, and those things, they're not tangible things that we can put our finger on, yet there they are. And so I'm a believer in that. And when I have that experience where you see the man's hope rise and the face fall, oftentimes for me, I find that really deep down that most are seeking know that what they seek is real. And we had a great friend in AA, a woman that was around for many years, and she passed away, but she just had this tenderness about her, this way of just reaching out and touching you and saying, "Oh, baby, God is real." And it was those kind of things. And Bill writes in the big book, he writes about these in step 2. The experience we have as we're going through that is that we we look at all of these examples that Bill gives us. And Bill was a guy who wrote what I would say is, my description of Bill's writing is that it was circular in nature. And what that means is that Bill would, of course, tell you what he's going to tell you, and then he would tell you what he just told you, and then he'd use some metaphor or another example or two or three or four to describe what he just told you. And then he would close by saying, just to make it perfectly clear, here's what I just told you. And We Agnostics is written in that same way. And some of the examples he uses are really, quite astounding. He uses the example of the prosaic steel girder, which means, everyday, ordinary, that word prosaic. And he uses a prosaic steel girder as a good example. It looks like this podium or our tables that we're sitting at or our big books. They look to be a certain thing, but science really tells us that it's not exactly what we see, that we're limited in our perception and our abilities. We only discovered ultraviolet, within my parents' generation. And there's light that we just can't see. We don't see everything. We don't feel everything. Really, it's this mass of electrons, Bill says, that it's whirling around and at incredible speeds. It's not really what it appears. That what that our senses somehow, there's things that lie outside of that realm of our perception. And he writes about the rocket ship to the moon. When the book was written in the late 1930s, and I believe we went 30 years later, 68, I think that might be about the right time that we actually went. But he said, our age is characterized by our readiness to change, to change our point of view. And I don't think he had any idea of how true that would become in 2014. We live in this age where, I have an iPhone up here with me that I'm using as my timer here today, and we all know, the iPhone is going to be in the distant past in a short amount of time. It's going to be some new device, and we're just willing to throw away something that doesn't work or doesn't work as well for something that does. And he points out that our age has really characterized this, and that's why we've made all these great advancements, and that's why even in the late 1930s, if you ask just an average person on the street, do you think we'll be able to go to the moon and explore by means of a rocket ship, that the people on the street would say, yes, this is right out of We Agnostics, that they would say, yeah, I bet they do it. It was just the mindset that people had. And he uses an example where he says the people in the past, the ancients were just as smart intellectually as we are today. That anthropologists tell us that this is true. That somehow, strange as it might seem, when they really look at it, they find that these people had great astronomical abilities and mathematical projections, and they were very high IQ people hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years ago. But why didn't those people, being that smart, make the kind of progress that we see today? And he said the answer's simple, that they were fettered by all types of superstitions and fixed ideas of all kinds. And this is the same, this is really the same place that I found myself coming into AA with this subject of God. And Bill says that perhaps we tie that word somehow to some notion that we had of childhood, or some childhood conception, or some limited deal, and that fetters us. And another part of my story is I know what that word means, fettered, because I've been fettered. I've had the fettered is when they put the ankle cuff on your leg, and the other end of that ankle cuff is to the desk that you're sitting before the judge on. And that's fettered. It goes from your leg to the wall. You can't get away. It's imprisonment. It's trapped. And this is Bill's metaphor for what it's like for us to not be willing to consider other ideas. And I think one of AA's greatest attributes must be this idea of when, therefore, we speak to you of God, we are always saying, we are always referring to your conception of God. And I've done a little bit of research on this, and if anybody has ideas on this, I'd love to hear your ideas over the weekend. But that, I don't know where the roots of that came from, really, if that's uniquely an AA thing, but I tend to think that it is. That even though the word God comes out of my mouth, it always means what that word means to you and never what it means to me. And it's quite helpful. It's why when I'm sponsoring somebody and we're going through this, I don't tell them what my own conception of God is or what particular spiritual practice that I subscribe to, because it's not important, because they're not going to wake up based on my spiritual experience. This is one of those experiences you've got to have for yourself. The big bang, the wow, I've got it. I think that I might be able to have something I can work with. And Bill uses this idea that we don't let any spiritual terms that we might have prejudices against deter us from honestly asking what those words mean to us. Here in the English language, I think we have this poverty of words, that we use this word God only because it's limited. It's just a way to communicate this idea of a power greater than myself as I conceive it, and it might mean something entirely different to you. And it's one of AA's. I just love that, because there is some requirements in AA that I think I should say this because it is in that third step that the only requirement for membership in Alcoholics Anonymous is a desire to stop drinking. And as near as I can tell, no one's checking too close. So really, what it becomes is you're a member of AA when you say you are. And if you're interested in reading the traditions or reading the long form of the traditions, then you should do that. But really, you're a member of AA when you say you are. So if you want to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's pretty easy. But the big book is clear. If you want recovery from alcoholism, there's some requirements. And the first requirement of the third step is that we begin to see that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. One of Bill's it's really, when I talk about Bill's circular abilities of his writing style and what a master he was of that, especially in We Agnostics, the thing that I think that he really writes about the most articulately, the way I could put it, is you might say he says, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Or he says, be open-minded, be open-minded, be open-minded, be open-minded. That's really the requirement in step 2. Don't let any of the spiritual terms. Bill tries to get away from the use of the word God in a lot of different ways and uses creative intelligence and spirit of the universe and czar of the heavens and power greater than ourself, and the word power in a proper term many times. But really it's about just trying to set aside what I think I know about God for an open mind and a new experience. That's really the prayer that I have my guys use when we're in We Agnostics. One of the best analogies that he uses is, Bill uses the analogy in We Agnostics of the Wright brothers. And he says that, it was an interesting time in our history because the men of science and the men of religion didn't agree on a lot. And he points that out, that that Galileo was nearly put to death for his astronomical heresies. It was because the men of science and the men of religion, the men of religion would stifle the advances of science because, of course, God didn't want us to do these things. But here was something, this idea of man flying, that science and religion agreed on at that time. The men of science took a little different tact, and they said that we have the best mathematicians in the world have proven that man can't fly. It's not possible. That we've studied the bees, the hummingbirds, the insects, the birds, and it just can't be done. And if anybody could do it, of course, it would be Professor Langley, and his flying machine went to the bottom of the Potomac River. So it just can't be done. And on the other side, the men of science said that if God would have meant man to fly, that man would have been born with wings. We should stop playing around with this stuff. It's rather dangerous. It's not in God's will that we should be experimenting with this kind of stuff. We hear this type of nonsense all the time today. That this right was somehow reserved for the birds, this right to fly. And thank God there were a couple of young men in the Carolinas that hadn't heard that man can't fly. A couple of bicycle mechanics. And I'm not saying that the Wright brothers didn't know a lot about flight, because they did. They had educated themselves quite a bit. But what they didn't do is they stopped believing that, they stopped the belief that somehow, they didn't subscribe to the belief that man couldn't fly. They had a little issue with it. Orville and Wilbur, right? Is that right? Orville and Wilbur. So I don't remember which one went first. Somebody maybe remembers, but let's just say for today's sake argument that Orville went first. But they did. Orville had to go, and then they said, well, we proved that a man can fly. But now, Wilbur, you got to get in the plane so we can show that man can fly. And I really love that about Alcoholics Anonymous. That, when I work with somebody and they wake up, and there's nothing better, I assure you, if you haven't had the experience, or and I will also say, if you are still driven by this merciless obsession, and you can't get the idea of the drink out of your head, and you're struggling with that, I'm going to be around all weekend, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you. And I really sincerely mean that. We're talking at a pretty high level here, but really when it comes down to it, it's just one alcoholic working with another. But when I'm working one alcoholic with another, and I'm reading this book, and I'm talking about the kinds of things that I'm talking about you here today, and it's working, and they're waking up, there's nothing better than that in life. For me, life makes perfect sense for me when I'm in that place. And but then when we're done and we've worked the steps, then it becomes about AA number 3. That's the real deal. That's the, okay, we proved that we can, this deal works, get sober, but let's go see if it's going to work for a lot of people. On this open-minded thing, there's, Bill calls this, he uses in one place, he calls it the agnostically inclined. So I think for a lot of us, when we look at we agnostics and we think, well, I'm not an agnostic, nor am I an atheist, and this doesn't really have a lot of application to me, and it must be for people that are struggling quite a bit more with this subject of God than a spiritual man such as myself, and we really fail to see what it says, because we all have a step 2 experience, regardless of if you've been around for a long time and you go back through the steps again, which is my particular AA family's way of going through the steps, is we find that it's somehow helpful after you've worked the steps after a period of time, or some people do it once every year, or some people do it when they're ready, but at some point the ego begins to rebuild itself, and we find ourselves in a real pickle, and we go back and say, listen, I would like to see if we can work the steps again, or we find somebody new that's got what we want and ask them to take us through the steps. And but this idea that we're agnostically inclined, I think if you sat here and listened to this talk, you'd think, well, Kenny's definitely not an agnostic. He's rather bullish about this idea of God. But then if you were to spend time with me over the next several weeks, you would find a guy that you would say, gosh, he doesn't look like a guy that has a lot of faith that God's going to take care of things at his work right now. He doesn't look like he thinks that a person that has a lot of faith that God is going to take care of his own kids the way that he took care of him. He seems to be a person that worries an awful lot about that and interjects and interferes with their life in ways that are not helpful. So I have a background in the maritime business, and particular in the fisheries up in Alaska, which is still the business I'm in today. And so this word inclination to us in that business means when there's a problem on the vessel and you're talking to the Coast Guard, he wants to know what your inclination is. And you tell him, well, I'm listing 15 degrees to port and I'm down by the head by 2 feet. Now, that doesn't mean that the boat's going to roll over on its port side and sink down bow first, but it's an inclination that if things continue to go that way, it's not going to be good. So, it says we agnostically inclined, and somehow I've really taken to meditate on that and thinking about that and looking at that for my own life. And what I find is that I'm agnostically inclined. When people come to me and tell me, oh my God, this miracle happened, and I was just there, and I was waiting, and I was my ropes in, I went out in the mailbox, and there was my check 4 days early, right when I needed it, and it's this miracle from God. I'm agnostically inclined. I'm like, well, geez, that's fantastic, and God works in miraculous ways, but what I'm really thinking is well, this is a coincidence, and it's not really what it seems. And I think probably after a period of time here in AA and working the steps, I'd have to tell you that my probably my greatest defect of character and my the shortcoming that weighs on me the most is my attitude towards not giving credence to what really is possible in the spiritual life. When I first got sober, I was completely out of my mind, to the point where I couldn't stop to read the book or read steps. But there was a guy in the meeting that talked about prayer and meditation every time they called on him, and his name was Ken. And so I thought, well, maybe I can ask Ken about meditation. I asked Ken about meditation, and he told me, gave me some way to sit and to concentrate on the breath, just some simple things. And I just knew, man, I have to find a way to calm down or I am toast. I was just, it was like a panic attack, but it wasn't a panic attack. It was like, I was just panicked all the time. There was no attack that came on. It was just... So, but anyways, as I got to know Ken, sometimes he would disappear for almost 2 weeks, and he'd come back, and I'd see him at the hall. I asked, where you been? He said, well, I was in meditation. I did a 10-day meditation. I fasted without food or water, and I meditated for 10 days. And he said, I used to go to India to meet with my gurus, and now I don't even have to travel. I just go into this meditation, and we communicate. And I get my lessons that way now. So, and he said when he's meditated for 10 days, he can pass through walls, he can walk around, and his feet don't touch the ground. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. My spiritual mentor is completely out of his mind. But years later now, I've become more open-minded on this subject. And the fact is that this is a shortcoming on my part, and this is an extreme example, I admit, but it's a shortcoming on my part to disregard the possibilities of the spiritual life when miracles in AA are with us all the time, right in front of us, and we like to tell ourselves it isn't so. And the truth is that I don't know what happens to you when you meditate for 10 days because I've never done it. I don't know if you can somehow transition and have these out-of-body experiences that he was describing, and I just don't know. So it's this is one of those situations where the knowing is better than the not knowing. On this subject of God, one of the guys I read, he likes to say, in the spiritual realm, when you get to the I don't know, and oftentimes you're already home. That being at the I don't know is a lot better than this endless search that in the end isn't very satisfying when we're looking for these answers. And Bill describes that. No one can fully describe or comprehend this power that we call God. No one. It can be experienced, but it's difficult. It's difficult to describe. So this agnostic inclination and this idea of being fettered. I'll give you an example from my own life on this, but that. When I was a young boy, I was homeless just before I got sober, but when I was a young boy, I was homeless many times because my family situation, sometimes it was better to live on the streets than it was to live in what was going on in my family's life. And so I would just kind of cruise around at night and, very naive. And I had a friend, this guy Steve, and at Steve's house, his parents had let him live in the garage. And he, had fixed this garage up, and it was just beautiful. Not only was it kind of still somewhat close to the parents' refrigerator, which was nice, but they really didn't care what was going on in the garage. And so it was just this fantastic deal. I would go over there and stay, and as long as he would let me, and it was just the coolest place. It was in the early mid 1970s, and he had blacklight posters and black lights, and he had speakers that were considerably larger than this podium right here, and it was just this unbelievable place. He had a bong that was so goddamn big. I'd have to ask Clancy to light it for me from here. It'd be like it was just this. And we'd listen to Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, and man, it was just a very, very cool place. And so years later, and other times in my life when I was homeless, I would see these clearly underutilized garages, and I would say to myself that God, if somebody would let me live in that garage, life would be wonderful. I mean, I would put up posters. I'd get a sound system. Steve also had a dog that was just the meanest German Shepherd you ever met. I mean, this dog was vicious, and I'd get me a vicious dog, and it was gonna be really something else. And so years later in sobriety, Shannon and I moved into, we'd been married a while, we moved into a nice house. Shannon's background's not a lot different than mine, and it was the nicest house either one of us had ever lived in our lives. And then 6 years ago, we moved to the home we live in now, which is the nicest home almost anybody we've ever known in our lives has ever lived in. And we've been really blessed, and somehow through the process of working the 12 steps, this obsession to destroy myself with alcohol was removed. And in that clarity, once that was gone, and it was no longer this driving force of more all the time that I couldn't control, I found that I was good at business, and I was able to take this experience I had with fishing and turn it into something kind of nice. And so we have this beautiful home now, but somehow in all that I was thinking about the garage. And I thought about how that was the fettered. And then I thought, when I was looking at those garages, I never saw the house. I never imagined that God would have me living in a house with a family, the best. And so that's my kind of analogy in the second step, this fettered idea of what AA has done for me, is that it released me from those kind of things. And now Shannon and I talk all the time about things that are good in our life, and then we think, well, let's be careful. Maybe this is the garage. What is it in our lives that's right in front of us that we can't even see? It's right there, but we can't even see it because we're focused on how great my life would be if it wasn't even going to be my garage. Somebody else was going to let me live in their garage. That was the best. Now, I did have a fellow actually just a couple days ago come up and say, that garage story you tell? He says, it occurred to me that once you're out of the garage, there comes certain responsibilities that a man might not want to, And so it's not for everybody. If the garage is your thing, I'm not here to say that you've got that it's not a gift from God. So, the next thing I'll say about there's this great transition in we agnostics that happens in 6 pages. And I warn people up front when they're working with me and we're going through the book. I let them know up front, this book is going to back you into a corner. there's certain things that you're going to have to ask yourself, certain questions you're going to have to ask yourself, certain things you're going to have to say that... So they say in what I call the second step question, which is, do you now believe, or are you even willing to believe that there's a power greater than yourself? It's a really simple thing. But it's, in the way that I read the big book, and this term, I read the book to myself, it's a little bit overused term because it doesn't really do very much justice to what I'm actually talking about. I'm talking about reading the book in the way that I've been talking today, and it's a conversation back and forth. And when we get to some place in the big book where it says that we ask ourselves this simple question, do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe that there's a power greater than myself? We don't go any further until we answer that question. That's what that means. So it's a pretty simple question. Yeah, most people can kind of slide through there and say, okay, I'm willing to believe. And you've explained to them, of course, that when you're using this term power greater than themselves, it means that to them. It can mean love. It can mean, all of these different things. And it's their own concept. And the big book gives you a lot of examples before they ask that question. And then 6 pages later, it becomes a little more difficult. Just in a short time, still in the second step, they say that God either is or He isn't. God is everything or He's nothing. God either is or He isn't. What was our choice to be? And it's the same thing. I don't stop until we make that choice. What's your choice going to be? You might have neatly evaded this. You might have put it off. You might have done this. We've been working now together for several months. We've been talking about this. Now we're at a place where you've got to make a choice here. God either is everything or He's nothing. God either is or He isn't. What's your choice to be? And although I'm here, at the podium talking about the big book, one of the real clear beliefs I've come to have is that our two pieces of primary literature, the big book and the 12 and 12, are really meant to complement each other. That as near as I've seen, I have not found one contradiction in either book that contradicts something that says in the other book. They're complementary of each other. They're totally different approaches. I always, when I take somebody through the steps, we start with the big book because that's the history of AA and the background and the doctor's opinion and all these great things. I mean, this is the basic text. This is our masterpiece here. So I take them this first. But in the 12 and 12, in the second step, Bill wrote that the experience they had, I think he was 3.5 years sober when he wrote what was in the big book, and he was 19 or 20 years sober, something like that, when he wrote the piece in the 12 and 12, maybe 18 when he started writing, and close to 20 years sober when he finished writing that, the piece on the second step. And he said that one thing they discovered along the way was that this hoop that we have to jump through in step 2 is larger than we ever imagined. Isn't that beautiful? It's just so amazing. It doesn't have to be this real hard approach into God is everything or He is nothing. There's room in that to answer and take that second step, make that second step choice without feeling too constrained. And it's one of the things on this subject which I love about AA, and it doesn't exist in a lot of spiritual groups, is I can say, well, here's the hurdle. Do you think you can get over this? oh man, I can't do it. I'm trying, I'm praying, I can't do it. I just don't. Okay, well, how about here? Can you get over that? Can you step ashore if the hurdle's here? I can't do it. What if I bring it all the way down to here? Can you come with me if we bring that? That's what Bill's saying. It's bigger than we ever imagined. If I have to bring it all the way down to here, to the bottom of the floor, just a few inches, do you think you can step ashore then? In the third step, they do a really good job of describing this actor who tries to play the director. That somehow in our lives, and I think this is true, he revisits this in the instructions in 4 and 5, this idea that we're actors trying to play the director. And it was such a great analogy for me to looking at this first requirement is that I be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. That when I looked at that first requirement, and I looked at the third step, the idea of being that I was really, that analogy fit. I was an actor trying to play the director. That I'd been, when I was assigned a role, I wasn't okay with it. The director, for the actors in the group, or the people that are here that have a background in that, which I don't, but I imagine that the director somehow has full control. Lights, how you're going to say your lines, what inflection you're going to put, what accent, what mannerisms, how you're going to hold your hands. All of those things are directed. But instead of taking the director's instructions, myself, I like to say, well, I'm not going to enter from stage left. I want to enter from center stage, and I don't want the lights. I want the lights to come down on me, and when I come, the music starts, not when. And everybody else can see that. Everybody else can see that the show's not going to come off very well. And the craziest thing about running our lives this way, and this is sober many years, I still find myself doing this, that not only am I convinced I know what's best for Kenny, I'm convinced I know what's best for everybody else. That's the danger that I get into, is that I become convinced of this. And of course, what usually happens? The show doesn't come off very well. And that in that place, not only do the actors see that everybody else can see, it's obvious to everybody else. For me, I'm still trying to kind of keep everything together, but it's obvious to everybody else what's going on. And so the other actors are what my friend Jim used to call, he used to call these the third step snatching promises. And they're, because they're from that part of the book. But that it makes everybody else want to snatch everything they can get out of the show and get out of there. People are like, hey, listen, I'm going to go in, I'm going to get a good review for myself, but then I'm out. I'm going to take my check and I'm gone. I can tell that the Kenny show is not going to come off very well. And it didn't. And so it was such a perfect analogy for me. And I began to see that, as an alcoholic, I was hard on other people. That I was really began to, comprehend the futility and fatality of life as I'd been living it. I begin to see that she didn't leave me, that I drove her away. That my boss wasn't an unreasonable, demanding so-and-so, that, I should maybe think about taking less 4-day weekends. And that, we get paid on Friday at lunchtime, and then I would call back, oh my gosh, I've come down with some really bad deal here at lunchtime and got a hold of some bad food, and then I wouldn't show up Monday morning either. And then when they fired me, it was this big deal. They returned to this in one of the later steps, but it's really the same analogy. And one of my current spiritual mentors, and the other analogy that they use on this is that we like to present a stage character. This is who we want our fellows to see. And he told me about this wonderful man that's in my life, told me that, this is the persona. This is the personality that I want other people to see, and that the origins of that word persona mean the mask. That I'm afraid if you could really see who I am, that somehow I'm not going to be good enough or funny enough or strong enough or educated enough or a good enough father or a good enough employee. If you somehow saw who I really am, my greatest fear is going to come to pass, which is that you are not going to like me and I am going to be all alone, and that in that sometime down the road I'm going to die alone and in pain. That this great fear forces me sober to have the persona, that the mask. And when we look at all of this combined, these things that I've talked about here this morning, and then Bill says in the third step, or the book reads in the third step, that we stood at the turning point. It means something, doesn't it? It really is. That's not a metaphor. You've done this. You've looked at what we had to say here. You've faced we share your honest doubt and prejudice in this issue. Bill goes to these great extremes with electricity and the prosaic steel girder and the rocket ship to the moon and Kitty Hawk. And in the end, what it was for me, it really wasn't any of those things. It was this piece that Bill said when many thousands of people flatly declare that since they've taken a certain attitude, or taken a certain attitude towards this power greater than themselves, their whole outlook on life has changed. And that's a bit of paraphrasing there, but that was it. It was the people in AA. I was so fortunate in early recovery to fall into the loving arms of a group of men that hand carried me through this step. And I promise you one thing, and that's that when I walked in to AA on June the 8th of 1989, a couple things were true. One is that I was not sober even 1 minute. And the other thing that's true is I didn't know anything that I just talked about this morning. None of it. It's all a gift. All of that was given to me. I fell into the loving arms, and I continue to do so, of great men in AA and spiritual mentors and sponsors that have spoon-fed and hand-carried me through these steps out of the big book. And I'll be forever grateful for that. That, when when we stand at the turning point and ask, there's a prayer there, we ask God for his protection and care with complete abandon. And the third step is this decision. And it's a busy morning, so I think I'll just end with this. There's so much more we could talk about on step 3, but I think in its elements, it's very simple. If you've done the work up to that point, it's a very easy process. It does say the words in that prayer, the prayer that was read, I think maybe it was Jim, but somebody read that third step prayer this morning right before this talk, and it says those words are quite optional, so I give people the ability, if they're the lower the bar kind of a guy, I'll tell them, hey, you don't have to use these words. Go ahead and write your own third step prayer and bring that, and we'll use that. It says the book's clear in those instructions, quite optional, these words. But it's really, what is it when we look at all of that, and then we look at the prayer, and we look at the first requirement is, and next, hereafter in this drama of life, we quit playing God, that, God is now going to be the director, that God is the principal, we're the agent. And I know what that means because I've had some time in business, and I'm the agent in a lot of cases today. And the agent not only needs to do the work of the principal, but you need to do the work of the principal in the principal's best interest. That's a little important. That God is that I'm the agent, that God is the principal, and those things. And then you really try to marry that up with what it says in the step, that we made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand God. And it seems when you just read the step off the wall, well, that's a very simple thing, and it is a very simple thing, provided you've done the work up to that point. But what is it that you're really deciding to do here in 3? And the way I characterize that with the guys that I sponsor is that the only thing I want you to make a decision on here, you don't have the ability to turn your will and your life over to the care of God. Or we would have a 3-step program. It would just be, I would just say, demon of alcohol be gone, and I would, and then boom, and it would be done. He'd make his decision, and off he'd go, and his life would be wonderful. But we're as alcoholics, this piece that Jung talked about, this characterization of this thirst that drove us to the drink being the same as the thirst that we have for a spiritual experience and to live a spiritual way of life and to know the presence of God in our life is the one and the same thing, and that unless we have the experience of knowing the presence of God in our life, we will always return to the drink. The third step is only a decision, the action. How do you turn your will and your life over to the care of God is steps 4 through 9. That's how I characterize it to the guys that I'm with. What I want you to know, if you do this prayer with me and you show up at my house and on next week and we're going to do this prayer, I'm going to expect that you're going to write inventory. I'm going to expect that you're going to do this 5th step. I'm going to expect that you're going to be humbled during that time, that we're going to work through that in 6 and 7. We're going to make a list of all of the people that you've harmed, and you're going to be out, if it takes a lifetime to do it, but you'll be out making amends for all of those harms. And in that process, somehow, these things that block us from the sunlight of the Spirit are removed, and I stand in the awareness of the presence of God in my life. And that's what happened for me. I was around a group of people. There was a guy that lived down in a little area of Seattle called Fremont, and he had a little studio apartment, and he would have me come over there. He'd read the book to him, and he was reading the book to me, and I would go over there. And he had nothing material. He didn't drive, so I had to go to his house. Didn't have a car. he had a little job where he was cutting these mats out for artwork, and cutting the mats out for framed art, and he would sell them to these frame shops. And so he had this paper stacked all over the place, and it was a studio apartment. And in that studio apartment, he would allow these guys that lived down underneath the bridge and lived around that area on the streets, these alcoholics who were not in recovery, they would just knock on his door, and they would say, hey, you know, would it be okay if I took a shower? And he'd say, come on in. He'd let him in. Would it be okay if I cooked a little something to eat? Go ahead. And this was going on while I'm working steps with this guy. And he told me, Kenny, since I've done this work, the sunlight of the Spirit shines in my life every single day. And he was an immensely happy guy. And I knew it wasn't anything material. I knew that it wasn't anything to do with the situation that he was in. That's what really got me, was that piece. In the end, after all these analogies, it was the people in AA that reached out to me and said, hey, you know, come with me and I'm going to show you a few things. And I will be forever grateful to them, these people. And one more time, you know, I want to thank Bob for asking me, and all of the beautiful, beautiful staff and the volunteers that have helped to put this together. When I look out in this packed room, it's just amazing to me that this is indeed our first annual. And I told this to Bob a while ago, you know, this is, it's you know, these kinds of things, it's just, this is going to be a gift to AA in this region from this year on. There's so many people that are going to benefit from what's been pulled off here and all the hard work by all of the committee members. And so I'm very grateful, and thank you very, very much for having me this morning.